Marcus wiped down the last table in the corner of Romano's Italian restaurant, his tired eyes scanning the empty dining room. At 23, he had been working double shifts for the past 2 years, trying to keep his head above water in a city that seemed determined to drown him in bills and broken dreams. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he stacked chairs, the familiar routine offering little comfort after another long day of forced smiles and careful politeness. His phone buzzed in his pocket, displaying another overdue notice from his landlord, $300 behind on rent, with barely enough in his bank account to cover groceries for the week. Marcus sighed and shoved the phone back into his pocket, focusing instead on the simple task of mopping the floor. At least here, in the quiet after-hours calm of the restaurant, he could think without the constant pressure of customers demanding his attention. The walls of Romano's were decorated with local artwork, paintings and sketches from struggling artists who hoped someone might notice their work and offer them a chance. Marcus had grown up surrounded by such dreams. His father, Jerome Williams, had been one of those artists once, a man with incredible talent and even bigger dreams, who had filled their small apartment with canvases and sketchbooks, always working on something new, always believing that the next piece would be the one to change their lives. But dreams didn't pay the bills, and when Marcus was 15, his father had died in a construction accident while working his second job. Jerome had left behind boxes of artwork, beautiful sketches and paintings that no one seemed to want, and a son who had learned too young that talent meant nothing without opportunity. Marcus had kept a few of his father's pieces, mostly small sketches that held special memories, but the rest had been sold for practically nothing or given away when they lost their apartment. Now, 8 years later, Marcus found himself in the same cycle of struggling to survive, while watching others live the life he had once dreamed of. The restaurant attracted wealthy clientele, business people and investors who would spend more on a single meal than Marcus made in 3 days. He served them with practiced professionalism, invisible to them except when they needed their water glasses refilled or their orders taken. Tonight had been particularly challenging. A group of Wall Street executives had occupied the large corner table for hours, celebrating some business deal, while Marcus attended to their every need. They had been polite enough, but there was something about the way they looked through him, as if he were just another piece of furniture in the restaurant, that left him feeling hollow. One of them, a well-dressed man in his 50s with silver hair and expensive cologne, had been particularly dismissive, snapping his fingers to get Marcus's attention and never once making eye contact when speaking to him. As Marcus finished cleaning, he thought about his father's sketchbook hidden in his backpack. He carried it with him everywhere, a habit he had developed after Jerome's death. The leather cover was worn smooth from years of handling, filled with his father's drawings of city life, portraits of strangers, and architectural sketches of buildings that had caught his eye. Jerome had been fascinated by the contrast between wealth and poverty in the city, often drawing scenes that captured both the glamour of high society and the struggles of working people. The sketchbook was one of the few things Marcus had left of his father, along with a small charcoal portrait Jerome had drawn of him when he was 12 years old. Marcus remembered sitting still for what felt like hours while his father worked, capturing every detail with the kind of patience and love that only a parent could have. That portrait now hung in Marcus's tiny studio apartment, a reminder of better times when his biggest worry was staying still long enough for his father to finish drawing. Marcus had inherited some of his father's artistic ability, but life had never given him the luxury of pursuing it. Between school and work, and now just work, there had been no time to develop whatever talent he might have possessed. Sometimes late at night in his apartment, he would flip through his father's sketchbook and wonder what might have been if Jerome had lived, if they had been able to stay in their apartment, if life had been just a little bit kinder to them. The restaurant's manager, Tony Romano, emerged from his office carrying the day's receipts. Tony was a good man who treated his employees fairly, but even he couldn't pay Marcus what he really needed to get ahead. The restaurant business was tough, and Tony was already being more generous than most employers would be by letting Marcus pick up extra shifts whenever possible. Another good day, Marcus, Tony said, counting the bills in his hands. That table of businessmen left a decent tip. Should help with your situation? Marcus nodded gratefully. Tony knew about his financial struggles, though Marcus had never gone into detail about just how bad things had gotten. The tip would indeed help, Maybe enough to convince his landlord to give him another week to come up with the rest of the rent money. "Thanks for letting me work the double shift again," Marcus said, untying his apron. "I know it's not easy covering the schedule." "You're one of my best servers," Tony replied honestly. "Customers like you, even the difficult ones. You've got a way of making people feel comfortable without being pushy. That's not something you can teach." As Marcus gathered his things and prepared to leave, he reflected on Tony's words. He had always been good at reading people, understanding what they needed even when they didn't say it directly. It was a skill his father had possessed too, the ability to see beyond the surface and understand the person underneath. Jerome had often said that was what made him a good artist. The capacity to see the truth in people and translate it onto paper. Walking out into the cool night air, Marcus felt the weight of another day's survival but not victory. Tomorrow would bring the same challenges, the same struggles to make ends meet while watching others live in comfort. He pulled his father's sketchbook closer to his chest, drawing strength from the connection to Jerome's dreams and determination. Somewhere in that worn leather cover were the hopes of a man who had never given up believing that things could be better, even when life proved otherwise again and again. The city lights reflected off the wet pavement as Marcus made his way home, unaware that tomorrow would bring a moment that would change everything he thought he knew about his father's legacy and his own future. The next evening at Romano's started like any other Tuesday night. Marcus arrived 30 minutes early, as was his habit, to help set up tables and review the reservations list. The dinner crowd was expected to be moderate, with a few regular customers and several new reservations that Tony had mentioned might be important business clients. Marcus went through his usual routine of checking his section, ensuring the silverware was properly polished and the water glasses spotless. Around 7 o'clock, the same group of Wall Street executives from the previous evening returned, requesting their preferred corner table. Marcus recognized them immediately, particularly the silver-haired man who had been so dismissive the night before. The man's name was Richard Blackwood, Marcus had learned from overhearing conversations, and he was apparently some kind of high-profile investor who commanded respect wherever he went. Marcus approached their table with the same professional demeanor he maintained with all customers, despite his personal feelings about how they had treated him. "Good evening, gentlemen. Can I start you off with some drinks tonight?" Richard barely glanced up from his phone as he ordered an expensive bottle of wine for the table. His colleagues followed suit with their usual requests, and Marcus dutifully wrote everything down, invisible once again to men who saw him only as a service provider. As he turned to leave, Marcus heard Richard mention something about a major art acquisition his company was considering, some pieces by an artist who had finally gotten the recognition he deserved. The evening progressed normally for the first hour. Marcus served their appetizers, refilled their drinks, and endured the casual way they ignored his existence while discussing million-dollar deals and exclusive gallery openings. He had grown accustomed to being treated as background noise by wealthy customers, but something about this particular group's attitude bothered him more than usual. Perhaps it was the way they spoke about money so carelessly, while he struggled to pay his basic bills, or maybe it was just the cumulative effect of too many similar encounters. During a brief lull in the dinner service, Marcus found himself wiping down tables near their section when Richard's phone rang. The investor answered immediately, his voice carrying clearly across the restaurant as he discussed what sounded like a very significant business deal. Marcus tried not to listen, but Richard's voice was loud and commanding, making it impossible to ignore. "The Jerome Williams collection is finally ready for market," Richard was saying, pacing slightly as he talked. "I've been waiting 3 years for this opportunity." The man was a genius with charcoal and graphite, absolutely incredible eye for urban landscapes and human emotion. His early sketches alone are worth 6 figures now. Marcus froze mid-motion, his cleaning cloth suspended over the table. His father's name, spoken so casually by this man who had treated him like dirt, hit him like a physical blow. Jerome Williams wasn't exactly an uncommon name, but the specific mention of charcoal sketches and urban landscapes made Marcus's heart race with a terrible possibility. Yes, I understand the seller wants to move quickly," Richard continued, unaware that every word was being absorbed by the server he had dismissed. 23 pieces in total, including some never-before-seen architectural studies. The gallery owner says Williams was working on a major series about economic inequality before his death. "Fascinating stuff," really captures the contrast between wealth and poverty in the city. Marcus felt the room spin slightly as he processed what he was hearing. His father had indeed been working on exactly that kind of series before his death. Marcus remembered the sketches scattered around their apartment. Drawings of homeless people sleeping in doorways of expensive hotels. Portraits of construction workers building luxury condominiums they could never afford to live in. Studies of children playing in parks surrounded by towering symbols of corporate wealth. The authentication process took longer than expected, Richard went on. But everything checks out. Jerome Williams died in 2016 construction accident. Left behind a substantial body of work that his family apparently sold off for nothing after his death. Classic story of an artist who never got to see his own success. Marcus's hands were shaking now as he realized what had happened. After his father's death, when they were facing eviction and desperate for money, his mother had sold most of Jerome's artwork to various dealers and collectors for whatever they would pay. They had been told the pieces weren't worth much, that local artists rarely gained any significant value, and that they were lucky to get anything at all for them. The few $100s they had received had seemed like a blessing at the time, enough to cover funeral expenses and buy them a few more weeks in their apartment. But now, 8 years later, those same pieces were being sold as a valuable collection, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Marcus thought about all the nights he had worked double shifts, all the bills he couldn't pay, all the opportunities he had missed because he was too busy surviving to live. His father's artwork, the legacy Jerome had left behind, was making other people wealthy while his own son struggled to keep a roof over his head. Richard finished his phone call and returned to the table, immediately launching into an excited explanation of the art deal to his colleagues. This Jerome Williams acquisition is going to be enormous for our investment portfolio. The art market has been hungry for this kind of authentic urban realism, and Williams' story adds the perfect tragic element that collectors love. Dead artist, family in poverty, undiscovered genius. It's all there, Marcus wanted to scream, to tell Richard exactly whose son was standing 3 feet away from him. But he forced himself to remain professional. He needed this job, couldn't afford to lose his temper no matter how justified his anger might be. Instead, he continued serving their table, his movements automatic while his mind raced with the implications of what he had learned. As the evening wore on, Richard continued discussing the Jerome Williams collection with obvious enthusiasm. He talked about individual pieces that Marcus remembered from his childhood, describing them with the clinical appreciation of someone who saw them only as financial investments. Marcus listened to his father's life and work being reduced to market trends and profit margins, feeling a mixture of pride that Jerome's talent was finally being recognized, and fury that none of that recognition was reaching the family he had left behind. When it came time to serve their main courses, Marcus's hands were still trembling slightly as he placed Richard's plate in front of him. The investor was in the middle of showing his colleagues something on his phone, presumably images from the Jerome Williams collection, when Marcus caught a glimpse of the screen. There, clear as day, was one of his father's most beautiful sketches, a drawing of a father and son walking through the city that Jerome had titled Future Dreams. Marcus recognized it instantly because he had been the model for the son in the drawing. He remembered the day his father had made him walk back and forth across their neighborhood while Jerome sketched furiously, capturing the movement and the relationship between the two figures. It had been one of Jerome's favorite pieces, and one of the hardest for Marcus to see sold after his father's death. Now that same sketch was being displayed on a phone as a valuable commodity, while the son who had posed for it served dinner to the man who was profiting from his father's legacy. The irony was so cruel and complete that Marcus almost laughed, a bitter sound that he managed to suppress just in time. Richard looked up from his phone just as Marcus finished serving the table, and for a moment their eyes met. But Richard saw nothing more than he had the night before, just another server doing his job, completely unaware that he was looking at the son of the artist whose work was making him wealthy. Marcus retreated to the kitchen area, his mind reeling from everything he had overheard. The revelation that his father's artwork was now worth a fortune, while he struggled to pay rent, felt like a cruel joke from the universe. He leaned against the wall next to the dishwashing station, trying to process the flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. Anger, grief, and a deep sense of injustice all competed for his attention while he forced himself to breathe steadily. Tony noticed Marcus's distressed state as he passed by carrying a tray of dessert plates. "You okay, son? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," Marcus replied automatically, though he was anything but fine. "Just need a minute to catch my breath." Tony paused, setting down his tray. He had known Marcus for 2 years and had never seen him look so shaken. "Take 5 minutes in the office if you need to. I can cover your tables for a bit." Marcus nodded gratefully and made his way to Tony's small office behind the kitchen. He sat down heavily in the worn chair beside the desk and pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling as he searched for information about Jerome Williams' art sales. What he found online confirmed his worst fears. Multiple auction sites and gallery listings showed his father's work selling for tens of thousands of dollars per piece. The total value of the collection Richard had been discussing represented more money than Marcus could ever hope to earn in his lifetime of serving tables. He thought about his mother, who had died 3 years after his father from complications related to diabetes that she couldn't afford to properly manage. She had worked herself to exhaustion trying to support them both after Jerome's death, never knowing that the artwork they had sold for grocery money would someday be worth enough to have saved her life. The medical care she needed, the better living conditions that might have prevented her decline, all of it could have been possible if they had just known what those sketches would become worth. Marcus opened his father's sketchbook, the one item he had refused to sell no matter how desperate things became. He flipped through the familiar pages, seeing his father's talent with fresh eyes now that he understood its true value. Every drawing was a masterpiece of observation and technique, capturing moments of human experience with a depth and compassion that spoke to universal truths about life and struggle. On one page, he found a sketch his father had made of him doing homework at their kitchen table, his young face screwed up in concentration as he worked through a math problem. Jerome had written a small note in the margin, "My son, my greatest masterpiece, my hope for a better tomorrow." The words, written in his father's careful handwriting, brought tears to Marcus's eyes as he realized that Jerome had seen their relationship as his true artistic achievement, more valuable than any drawing he had ever created. After several minutes of solitude, Marcus felt ready to return to work. He couldn't change what had happened to his family, couldn't undo the unfairness of their situation, but he still needed to finish his shift and collect his tips. As he walked back toward the dining room, he made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. He was going to tell Richard Blackwood exactly who he was, consequences be damned. But as he approached their table with the dessert menu, Marcus found his resolve wavering. What would be the point of such a revelation? Richard would probably dismiss him as a liar looking for money, or worse, he might create a scene that would cost Marcus his job. The wealthy man had shown no empathy or basic human decency toward a server. Why would he suddenly care about that server's connection to his latest investment? Richard was in the middle of another phone conversation when Marcus arrived at their table, this time speaking to what sounded like a museum curator about a potential exhibition of Jerome Williams' work. "The story is perfect for a major show," Richard was saying. "Working-class artist died young, family never knew his true worth. We could really play up the tragedy angle, get some serious media attention for the whole collection." Marcus's jaw tightened as he heard his family's pain being described as a marketing opportunity. The tragedy angle Richard spoke of so casually represented years of hardship, sacrifice, and loss that had shaped every day of Marcus's life since his father's death. To hear it reduced to a selling point for wealthy collectors was almost more than he could bear. As Richard ended his call, Marcus approached with the dessert menus. "Can I interest you gentlemen in any desserts this evening? Our tiramisu is particularly good tonight." Richard waved him away dismissively. "Just coffee for the table and make sure it's actually hot this time." The casual rudeness coming on top of everything else Marcus had learned that evening finally pushed him past his breaking point. Instead of retreating to fulfill the coffee order, Marcus stood his ground beside their table. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his father's sketchbook, holding it carefully in his hands. "Excuse me, Mr. Blackwood," Marcus said, his voice steady, despite the hammering of his heart. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation about Jerome Williams's artwork." Richard looked up with obvious irritation. "I hardly think my business discussions are any concern of a waiter. Now about that coffee." "This is one of his sketchbooks," Marcus continued, opening the worn leather cover to reveal his father's drawings. Jerome Williams was my father. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Richard's expression shifted from irritation to confusion, to something that might have been skepticism. His colleagues stopped their own conversations to stare at the young server who had just claimed a connection to the artist they had been discussing all evening. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" Richard asked, his voice less certain than it had been moments before. Marcus opened the sketchbook to the page containing the sketch of father and son walking together, the same image he had seen on Richard's phone earlier. "This is the original sketch for Future Dreams, one of the pieces in the collection you're buying. I'm the boy in the drawing. My father made this when I was 12 years old." Richard's face went pale as he stared at the sketch, then at Marcus, then back at the sketch. The resemblance between the boy in the drawing and the young man standing before him was unmistakable, even accounting for the years that had passed. The way Jerome had captured his son's features, the distinctive shape of his eyes and the set of his jaw, left no room for doubt about Marcus's identity. "That's impossible," Richard whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. He was looking at Marcus with new eyes now, seeing not just a server but a person with a story, a connection to something he thought he owned and understood. Marcus turned to another page in the sketchbook, revealing the portrait his father had drawn of him at the kitchen table. "Jerome Williams died in a construction accident 8 years ago. My mother and I sold most of his artwork for whatever we could get, because we were facing eviction and couldn't afford his funeral expenses. We were told the pieces weren't worth much." The silence at the table was complete now. Richard's colleagues were staring at Marcus with expressions of shock and growing understanding. The young man they had ignored for 2 evenings, who had served their meals and endured their dismissive treatment, was the son of the artist whose work they had been celebrating and planning to profit from. Richard reached for his wine glass with a shaking hand, but never made it to his lips. The glass slipped from his fingers and shattered against the floor, red wine spreading across the white tablecloth like spilled blood. In that moment of clumsiness and shock, the entire dynamic of the evening shifted irrevocably. The broken wine glass lay scattered across the floor, its fragments catching the restaurant's soft lighting like tiny mirrors reflecting a shattered reality. Richard stared at the mess for a long moment, as if trying to process not just the accident but the entire revelation that had preceded it. His colleagues sat in stunned silence, the comfortable dynamic of their evening completely disrupted by Marcus's quiet declaration. Marcus knelt down and began collecting the larger pieces of glass, his server instincts taking over even in this extraordinary moment. "I'll get this cleaned up for you right away," he said, though his voice carried none of the deferential tone he had used throughout the evening. "No, wait," Richard said, his voice hoarse with shock. "Don't just leave it for now." He looked up at Marcus, really seeing him for the first time in 2 days of interaction. "You're really Jerome Williams's son?" Marcus stood up slowly, still holding pieces of the broken glass. "Yes, sir. Born Marcus Jerome Williams, named after my father. He used to bring me to construction sites sometimes when I was little, and he'd sketch the buildings while I played in the dirt. He said he wanted to capture how the city was changing, how new wealth was pushing out the old communities." One of Richard's colleagues, a younger man named David, leaned forward with obvious interest. "Can we see more of the sketchbook? I mean, if you don't mind sharing." Marcus hesitated for a moment, then sat down in an empty chair that had been pulled over from another table. He opened the sketchbook carefully, treating it with the reverence it deserved. Page by page, he revealed his father's work to the men who had been planning to profit from it, without ever knowing the human story behind it. "This one is from outside the Metropolitan Museum," Marcus said, showing them a detailed sketch of wealthy patrons entering the building, while homeless individuals sat ignored on the steps nearby. "Dad spent 3 days there, watching how people interacted with each other. He said art should make people uncomfortable sometimes, force them to see things they usually ignored." Richard was studying each drawing with intense focus, his business demeanor replaced by something approaching genuine emotion. "The technique is extraordinary. The way he captures expression and body language. The social commentary embedded in every composition. I've been in the art world for 20 years and I've rarely seen work this powerful." He was always drawing, Marcus continued, turning to a sketch of their old neighborhood. "Even when we could barely afford art supplies, he'd use whatever he could find. Pencil stubs, paper napkins, the backs of utility bills. He said inspiration didn't wait for convenience. David shook his head in amazement. And you said your family sold these pieces for almost nothing? We didn't know, Marcus replied, a note of old pain creeping into his voice. After Dad died, Mom was working 2 jobs and I was trying to finish high school. The rent was overdue. The funeral home was demanding payment and we had creditors calling every day. Some art dealer came to our apartment and said he'd take the paintings and sketches off our hands, help us out during a difficult time. How much did he pay you? Richard asked quietly. Marcus looked down at his hands. $800 for everything. 43 pieces total. Mom cried when she signed the papers because she knew Dad would have hated to see his work go, but we didn't have a choice. The dealer said we were lucky he was being so generous that local artists rarely had any market value. The table fell silent again as the men processed this information. $800 for artwork that was now worth hundreds of thousands. The mathematics of exploitation were stark and undeniable. A perfect example of how desperation could be leveraged by those with knowledge and resources. Richard pulled out his phone and began scrolling through images from the Jerome Williams collection. This sketch here, the one of the construction worker eating lunch in front of a luxury hotel. Do you remember your father drawing this? Marcus leaned over to look at the phone screen, and his face broke into the first genuine smile of the evening. That's Miguel Hernandez. He worked with my dad on 3 different job sites. Dad always said Miguel had the best stories about the buildings they worked on, how they'd transform neighborhoods and displace families who had lived there for generations. Your father drew him several times, Richard noted, swiping to show another sketch of the same man. Miguel was at Dad's funeral, Marcus said softly. He told me that Jerome was the only guy on the crew who ever really listened to people, who saw them as more than just labor. He said Dad had a gift for making everyone feel important. Richard set down his phone and looked directly at Marcus. I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Are you telling me this story because you want money? Because you think you have some claim to these pieces? Marcus met his gaze steadily. I don't want anything from you, Mr. Blackwood. I can't afford a lawyer to fight over ownership, and I wouldn't know where to start even if I could. I just wanted you to know that the tragic story you were talking about earlier isn't just marketing material. It's my life. It's my mother working herself to death because she couldn't afford diabetes medication. It's me working double shifts to keep a roof over my head while my father's art makes other people wealthy. But surely you must want some kind of compensation, David interjected. I mean, your family was clearly taken advantage of during a vulnerable time. Marcus shrugged, a gesture that seemed to carry the weight of years of resignation. Wanting something and being able to get it are 2 different things. I learned a long time ago that life isn't fair, especially if you're poor. Rich people have lawyers and connections and time to fight for what they think they deserve. Poor people have jobs to get to and bills to pay. Richard was quiet for a long moment, studying Marcus with an expression that seemed to be constantly shifting. You know, I've spent my entire career acquiring art, evaluating its worth, predicting market trends. But I've never met the family of an artist whose work I was buying. I never really thought about the human story behind the pieces. Most people don't, Marcus replied. Art becomes a commodity once it enters the market. The person who created it, the life they lived, the family they left behind, none of that matters to collectors and investors. You just see dollar signs and portfolio diversification. The accusation hung in the air, direct and uncompromising. Richard's colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps recognizing themselves in Marcus's description of their industry. You're not wrong, Richard admitted, surprising everyone at the table, including himself. I've made millions of dollars buying and selling art without ever considering the artists as human beings. They were just names attached to potentially profitable objects. Marcus closed the sketchbook and prepared to stand up. Well, now you know. Jerome Williams had a son who loved him, a wife who sacrificed everything for him and dreams that were bigger than his circumstances. He died believing his art would never be recognized, never be valued. I guess he was half right. As Marcus began to rise from his chair, Richard reached out and gently touched his arm. Wait, please don't go yet. I think we need to talk about this more seriously. Marcus hesitated at Richard's touch, unsure whether to trust this sudden shift in the wealthy investor's demeanor. Throughout his life, he had learned to be wary of promises from people with money and power, having seen too many instances where good intentions evaporated when they conflicted with financial interests. But something in Richard's voice suggested a sincerity that hadn't been there earlier in the evening. "What exactly do you want to talk about?" Marcus asked, settling back into his chair but keeping his posture guarded. Richard glanced around the restaurant, suddenly aware that their conversation might be overheard by other patrons. "Is there somewhere more private we could continue this discussion? This is important, and I don't want to have this conversation in a public dining room." Tony Romano appeared at their table, having noticed the broken glass and the unusual seating arrangement. "Everything okay over here? Marcus, do you need me to call someone to clean up this mess?" "It's fine, Tony," Marcus replied. "Just a small accident with the wine glass. I can clean it up in a minute." Richard stood up, pulling out his wallet. "Actually, I'd like to settle our bill and perhaps speak with Marcus privately for a few minutes, if that's acceptable to everyone involved." Tony looked between Marcus and the wealthy businessman, clearly sensing that something significant was happening, but unsure what role he should play. "Marcus, you don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with. You're on my clock right now, so if you need backup or want me to stay, just say the word." Marcus appreciated Tony's protective instinct, but he was curious enough about Richard's intentions to hear him out. "It's okay. I think Mr. Blackwood has something important to discuss, and it relates to some family business." After settling their substantial bill and leaving a tip that was larger than Marcus typically made in an entire shift, Richard's colleagues excused themselves, clearly recognizing that whatever was about to happen needed to occur without an audience. David handed Marcus his business card before leaving, saying quietly, "If you ever need someone to verify your story or provide testimony about tonight's conversation, don't hesitate to call me." Tony offered the use of his office for their private discussion, and soon Marcus and Richard found themselves alone in the small cluttered space behind the kitchen. Richard sat across from Marcus at Tony's desk, looking distinctly uncomfortable in the modest surroundings that were so different from his usual environment of boardrooms and exclusive clubs. "I want to start by apologizing," Richard began, his voice carrying a humility that seemed unfamiliar to him. "For the past 2 evenings I treated you exactly the way I treat all service workers, as if you were invisible, as if you didn't matter. That was wrong of me under any circumstances, but knowing what I know now makes my behavior inexcusable." Marcus nodded but remained silent, waiting to see where this conversation was heading. "I've been thinking about what you said, about your family being taken advantage of during a vulnerable time," Richard continued. "The art dealer who bought your father's work for $800 knew exactly what he was doing. He exploited your grief and desperation to acquire pieces that he knew would be valuable someday. That's how business works," Marcus replied with a bitter edge to his voice. "People with knowledge and resources take advantage of people without them. You should understand that better than most." Richard winced at the accusation but didn't dispute it. "You're absolutely right. I've built my career doing exactly that, identifying undervalued assets and acquiring them before their true worth becomes apparent to others. The difference is that I usually deal with other wealthy people, who have their own teams of experts and lawyers. What happened to your family was predatory, so what are you proposing to do about it?" Marcus asked. "Are you planning to give me back my father's artwork out of the goodness of your heart? Are you going to track down that art dealer and demand justice for my family?" "I can't undo what happened 8 years ago," Richard admitted. "The legal ownership of those pieces has been transferred multiple times, and trying to unravel all those transactions would be virtually impossible. But I can do something about the future." Marcus leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "What do you mean?" Richard pulled out his phone and showed Marcus several images from the Jerome Williams collection. "I wasn't entirely honest earlier when I said there were 23 pieces in the collection I'm acquiring. There are actually 31 pieces, but 8 of them are being held back by the current owner for a separate sale. What does that have to do with me? I want to buy those 8 pieces and give them to you," Richard said simply. "Not sell them to you, not offer you a payment plan, but give them to you outright. They belong with Jerome Williams's family, and his family consists of one person, you." Marcus stared at Richard in shock, unsure whether he had heard correctly. "You want to give me 8 of my father's paintings worth, what, tens of thousands of dollars each?" "Closer to $20,000 per piece based on current market valuations," Richard confirmed. "But their value to you is immeasurable. These aren't just investments or portfolio assets. They're your inheritance, your connection to your father's legacy, and your rightful property that was stolen from you during a moment of desperation." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. The offer was so unexpected, so generous that he struggled to process it. Why would you do that? You don't owe me anything. You're a businessman, not a charity. Because meeting you tonight has forced me to confront something I've been avoiding my entire career. Richard replied, his voice growing more earnest. I've made millions of dollars from other people's creativity and pain, but I've never had to look those people in the eye. I've never had to see the human cost of my success. Richard stood up and began pacing in the small office, his expensive suit looking out of place among Tony's file cabinets and restaurant supply catalogs. Do you know what I was planning to do with your father's collection? I was going to loan it to a major museum for an exhibition about urban poverty and economic inequality. The irony would have been perfect, showcasing art about the struggles of working people while the artist's own son worked as a server to survive. That is pretty ironic, Marcus agreed quietly. But here's what I'm thinking now. Richard continued, turning to face Marcus directly. What if instead of me owning those pieces and lending them to museums, you owned them? What if Jerome Williams's son was the one who decided how his father's work was displayed? What message it conveyed, what story it told? Marcus shook his head slowly. I wouldn't know the first thing about managing an art collection or dealing with museums. I'm a server at an Italian restaurant, not a curator or gallery owner. Those are skills that can be learned, Richard said. What can't be learned is the authentic connection you have to the work, the understanding of what your father was trying to say through his art. You knew Jerome Williams the man, not just Jerome Williams the artist. You understand the experiences that shaped his vision. The conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock on the office door. Tony peered in, looking apologetic for the intrusion. Sorry to bother you, but we're closing up for the night. Marcus, I need to know if you're clocking out or if you need to finish your shift. Marcus realized that he had been so absorbed in his conversation with Richard that he had completely forgotten about his responsibilities at the restaurant. I should finish cleaning my section and cash out my tips. Actually, Richard interjected, I'd like to continue this conversation over the next few days if you're willing. This isn't the kind of decision that should be made in a restaurant office at closing time. Richard pulled out his business card and wrote his personal cell phone number on the back. I'm serious about this offer, Marcus. I want you to think about it. Maybe do some research on your own about art ownership and management. I can put you in touch with people who can help you understand your options. Marcus took the card, still struggling to believe that this conversation was really happening. You're talking about changing my entire life. I've never owned anything worth more than a few $100s. I wouldn't even know how to insure artwork worth that much money, let alone preserve it or display it properly. All of those concerns are solvable, Richard assured him. Money can buy expertise, proper storage, insurance coverage, professional advice. What money can't buy is the legitimacy and authenticity that you would bring to your father's legacy. As they prepared to leave Tony's office, Richard paused at the door. I want you to know that this isn't about guilt or charity. This is about doing something right for once in my career. Your father's art deserves to be represented by someone who understands its true meaning, and you deserve to benefit from the talent and vision he passed down to you. Marcus walked Richard to the restaurant's front door, still carrying his father's sketchbook under his arm. The wealthy investor looked back at the modest establishment with what might have been newfound respect. I'll call you tomorrow afternoon, Richard said as he prepared to leave. But I want you to promise me something. Don't make this decision based on what you think you should do or what seems practical. Think about what your father would have wanted, what would honor his memory and his work. After Richard left, Marcus stood alone in the empty restaurant, surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of his working life. The tables he had served hundreds of times, the floors he had mopped countless nights, the kitchen where he had grabbed hurried meals between shifts. Everything looked the same, but something fundamental had changed in the span of a single evening. He opened his father's sketchbook one more time, looking at the drawings with new eyes. These weren't just memories anymore. They were potentially the foundation for a completely different future. But the question that haunted him as he finally finished his closing duties was whether he was brave enough to believe that such a future was actually possible. 3 weeks later, Marcus stood in the climate-controlled storage facility, where 8 of his father's artworks were carefully housed in protective frames and archival materials. Richard had been true to his word, purchasing the pieces and transferring ownership to Marcus without any conditions or expectations of repayment. The legal paperwork had been handled by Richard's attorney, who had also helped Marcus understand the responsibilities and opportunities that came with owning valuable artwork. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of learning and adjustment. Marcus had taken a leave of absence from Romano's, though Tony had assured him that his job would be waiting if he ever wanted to return. With Richard's guidance, Marcus had been introduced to art historians, museum curators, and gallery owners who were eager to learn more about Jerome Williams's work and the personal story behind it. Dr. Sarah Chen, a professor of contemporary art at the local university, had been particularly helpful in explaining the broader context of Marcus's father's work. "Your father was documenting a crucial period in urban development," she had told Marcus during one of their meetings. "His sketches capture the human impact of gentrification and economic displacement in ways that academic studies can't convey. This isn't just art, it's social documentation of historical importance." Marcus had also learned that the art dealer, who had bought his family's collection for $800, had sold it just 2 years later for nearly $50,000, confirming his suspicions about how badly they had been exploited. While there was no legal recourse available after so many years, the knowledge helped him understand that his father's work had been valuable all along, even when they were told otherwise. The piece Marcus found himself drawn to most often was a large charcoal drawing titled Inheritance, which showed a construction worker passing a hard hat to his young son while skyscrapers rose in the background. Jerome had never shown this particular sketch to Marcus during his lifetime, but the symbolism was unmistakable. It was his father's meditation on legacy, on what we pass down to our children beyond material possessions. Richard had visited the storage facility several times, often bringing potential collaborators who were interested in Marcus's story and his father's work. But he had been careful to let Marcus make his own decisions about how to proceed, offering advice only when asked and making it clear that the artwork belonged entirely to Marcus now. "I've been thinking about what you said, about honoring my father's memory," Marcus said during one of Richard's visits. "I want to do something that would make his work accessible to people like us, not just wealthy collectors and museum patrons." "What did you have in mind?" Richard asked, genuinely curious about Marcus's developing vision. "A mobile exhibition," Marcus replied, his excitement growing as he explained his idea. "We could create a traveling display that would visit community centers, public libraries, schools, and working-class neighborhoods. Places where people like my father would actually go, where they could see his work and understand that their stories matter enough to be called art." Richard smiled, recognizing something of his own entrepreneurial instincts in Marcus's proposal. "That's a brilliant idea. It would require some logistical planning and funding, but it's absolutely doable. Have you thought about what you'd call this exhibition?" Marcus looked back at the drawing of the father passing the hard hat to his son. "I want to call it Future Dreams, after the sketch that started all of this, the one where my father drew the two of us walking together." Over the following months, Marcus worked with a team of art handlers, educators, and community organizers to develop the traveling exhibition. Richard provided initial funding and business expertise, but the vision and direction came entirely from Marcus. They created interactive displays that encouraged viewers to share their own stories about work, family, and dreams deferred or achieved. The first stop for Future Dreams was at the community center in Marcus's old neighborhood, the same area where many of his father's sketches had been created. Marcus gave a brief talk before the opening, standing in front of a room filled with construction workers, servers, house cleaners, and other working people who rarely found themselves in art galleries. "My father believed that every person has a story worth telling," Marcus began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "He drew these pictures because he wanted to show that our lives, our struggles, our hopes are just as important as anyone else's. Art isn't just for rich people in fancy galleries. It's for all of us." Among the attendees was Miguel Hernandez, the construction worker who had been one of Jerome's subjects and had spoken at his funeral. Now in his 60s, Miguel stood in front of the sketch Jerome had made of him eating lunch outside a luxury hotel, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Your father saw me," Miguel told Marcus after the presentation. "Most people look right through guys like me, but Jerome saw me as a person with dignity. He made me feel important." The exhibition's success led to bookings at dozens of other venues across the city, and eventually in other states. Marcus found himself traveling with his father's work, sharing Jerome's story and encouraging others to find value in their own experiences. He had traded his server's apron for the role of curator and educator, but he never forgot the years of struggle that had led him to this moment. Richard attended the opening at the community center, but he stayed in the background, watching Marcus command the room with natural authority and genuine passion. After the formal presentation ended, he approached Marcus with obvious pride. "Your father would be incredibly proud of what you've accomplished," Richard said. "You've taken his work and given it a purpose he never could have imagined." Marcus looked around the room at all the people studying his father's drawings, sharing their own stories, making connections between Jerome's observations and their own lives. I think he knew this would happen someday. That's why he kept drawing even when no one seemed to care, even when we couldn't afford proper art supplies. He believed in the power of his work to touch people. As the evening wound down and the last visitors made their way out of the community center, Marcus carefully supervised the packing of his father's artwork for transport to the next venue. Each piece was handled with the reverence it deserved, protected and preserved for future generations to discover and appreciate. Standing alone in the empty exhibition space, Marcus pulled out his father's old sketchbook, the same one he had carried to work at Romano's on that life-changing evening months earlier. He turned to a blank page in the back and began to sketch the scene he had just witnessed. People of all ages and backgrounds gathered around his father's art, finding pieces of themselves reflected in Jerome's vision of urban life and human dignity. As he drew, Marcus realized that he was continuing his father's work in his own way, documenting moments of connection and understanding, preserving stories that might otherwise be forgotten. The inheritance Jerome Williams had left his son wasn't just the artwork itself, but the responsibility to ensure that working people's stories continued to be told, valued, and remembered. The sketch Marcus created that night would eventually become the logo for the Jerome Williams Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting artists from working-class backgrounds and ensuring that art remained accessible to all communities. It was Marcus's way of honoring not just his father's memory, but the dreams and struggles of everyone who had ever felt invisible to the world around them. From server to curator, from struggling son to keeper of his father's legacy, Marcus had discovered that sometimes the most profound changes in life come not from what we seek, but from having the courage to speak our truth when the moment demands it. And in a storage facility filled with his father's artwork, surrounded by the tools and resources to share Jerome's vision with the world, Marcus finally understood that his father's greatest masterpiece hadn't been any single drawing or painting, but the son he had raised to carry forward his dreams of a more just and compassionate world.